3 takeaways from a tumultuous day in politics. It has been a big, even historic week in American politics. Donald J. Trump was indicted. The liberal candidate for Wisconsin Supreme Court, Janet Protasiewicz, easily prevailed over a conservative, Daniel Kelly, and Brandon Johnson, a progressive, was elected the mayor of Chicago. What did we learn? While in some cases it's too soon to say much, here are a few early takeaways if the 2022 midterm elections offered any lesson. It was that liberals excel when abortion and democracy are on the ballot. Liberal voters turn out en masse. A crucial sliver of voters, perhaps as few as 1 in every 30 or 40, will flip to vote for the Democrat when they otherwise would have voted Republican. That pattern continued in Wisconsin on Tuesday, when the liberal candidate won by 11 points, a striking margin for Wisconsin. Like many of the best Democratic showings of 2022, the Wisconsin race seemed likely to decide the fate of the state's abortion ban and its gerrymandered legislative maps. Interestingly, Wisconsin was not a state where Democrats excelled last November. They didn't fare poorly, but Senator Ron Johnson still won re-election and the incumbent Democratic governor won by just 3 points. The 2022 showing was no Democratic romp like in Pennsylvania or Michigan, where a Stop the Steal candidate or abortion referendum helped Democrats. This time, the issues facing Wisconsin voters were more like those in Michigan and Pennsylvania. As a result, Wisconsin liberals won a Pennsylvania-like and Michigan-like landslide. It's still far too soon to say how the indictment of Mr. Trump will play out, but there are already plenty of signs that he has gained among Republican primary voters since last Thursday, when news of the indictment broke. Indeed, all 4 polls taken over this period showed Mr. Trump gaining compared with their previous survey. We'll probably return to this question in more depth next week. After all, none of these polls were taken after his flight to New York or his surrender to authorities in Manhattan. And he was already gaining before the news of his indictment, so it's hard to distinguish his latest gains from the continuation of a longer-term trend. Still, it would be no surprise if Mr. Trump is benefiting from the indictment. For days, the conservative media ecosystem has been dominated by a chorus of his defenders, including none other than his chief rival, Ron DeSantis. This is about as favorable of a media environment as it gets for a Republican primary candidate. How this will play over the longer term, especially if Mr. Trump faces other indictments, remains to be seen. The Chicago mayoral race wasn't a Democratic primary, but it was about as close as it gets for a general election. Both candidates were Democrats, and 82% of Chicago voters backed Mr. Biden in 2020. Like many Democratic primaries over the last decade, it pitted an activist-backed progressive against a more moderate candidate. But while we've grown accustomed to victories for moderate Democrats in most of these intra-primary fights, in Chicago it was the progressive candidate Brandon Johnson who prevailed. That's in no small part thanks to the backing of black voters, who have often offered decisive support to high-profile establishment-backed candidates, from Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden to Eric Adams. With many examples of black voters backing moderate candidates over the years, it can be tempting to assume that they are the reliable moderate allies of the establishment. In reality, it's not so simple. In particular, black voters have often backed black progressives over white moderates and liberals. In the New York mayoral race, black voters overwhelmingly backed Mr. Adams over the liberal Catherine Garcia, even though they also preferred the black progressive Maya Wiley over Ms. Garcia, based on data from ranked choice balloting. When black voters side with progressives, the establishment's position suddenly looks a lot weaker. Black voters represent around 20% of Democratic voters. Mr. Johnson, who is black, routinely won 80% of the vote in the South Side's majority black wards, helping him squeak past the moderate Paul Vallas, who won much of the rest of the city. Mr. Johnson's success doesn't necessarily mean that black Democrats are feeling the burn, or otherwise itching to support progressive candidates. In this year's primary, Mr. Johnson fared best in relatively young and white progressive areas on Chicago's North Side, while the incumbent, Lori Lightfoot, carried the South Side wards where Mr. Johnson would dominate just a month later. But the importance of black voters to progressive fortunes might offer a lesson for activists who hope one of their own might win a Democratic presidential primary. After all, the last candidate to beat the Democratic establishment in such a Democratic primary was none other than Barack Obama.